Good morning and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Suddhāso and we'll be looking at another discourse of the Buddha today. This one's from the Sutta Nipata, chapter 3, sutta number 8, the Sallasutta. So we'll start with homage to the Buddha and then I'll read through the discourse and give some explanation. And you can type in questions at any time and I'll respond to questions at the end. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ Dhammaṃ Saṅghaṃ namasami. So as mentioned, we'll be looking at Sutta Nipata 3.8, the Sallasutta. So there are other suttas with this name. There's actually another much more well-known sutta by the same name. So the word salla means arrow or a dart. It's used in the suttas both in a literal sense, so literally meaning an arrow or a dart, but it's also used in a metaphoric sense to indicate a sharp stabbing pain. So like if you got shot by an arrow, then you would experience a sudden sharp pain. So the word salla, although it literally means arrow or dart, it's sometimes used in that sense of like a sudden sharp pain, either physical or mental. And the more well-known Sallasutta is the simile of the second arrow, which, again, it's relatively commonly quoted discourse where the Buddha is basically saying that although physical pain is unavoidable, mental pain is not. So there he's giving the simile of the two arrows. So he says an ordinary person gets shot with one arrow, which is physical pain, and then they immediately shoot themselves with a second arrow, which is mental pain. So in that discourse on the arrow, the Buddha is saying that you should try to stick to just the first arrow, because that one you can't avoid, but you can avoid the second one. But here the Buddha is talking about a different aspect of dukkha. So I'll start reading through this discourse, and this discourse is all in poetic form. So I'm reading from Bhante Sujata's translation, but I might make some comments as I go along because the translation of Pali poetry is often quite nuanced and with multiple connotations. So the first line in Pali says, Animittang ananyatang maccanang irajivitang kasarancha paritancha tancha dukkhena sangyutang. So Bhante Sujata translated this as, unforeseen and unknown is the extent of this mortal life. It is hard and short and bound to pain. So in Pali, animittang ananyatang. So animittang means it has no nimitta. There's nothing that you can see. There's nothing that you can observe. And ananyatang means it is unknown. And maccanang irajivitang means the life of mortals here, the life of mortal beings. So again, this is saying that we can't see and know how long our life is going to last. In other words, it's unpredictable when we're going to die. And then he says that this life is kasira, which means difficult, and paritta, limited. So difficult and short, and dukkhena sangyutang, it's constantly connected with dukkha. It's constantly connected with pain and suffering. So the Buddha here is starting off with a just simple, down-to-earth acknowledgement of the facts of life, or that life is of an unpredictable duration. We don't know exactly how long we're going to live. But life overall tends to be short, difficult, and painful. I think there's a famous quote in English which goes something like this: life is nasty, brutish, and short. Who said that? Anyway, so that's basically what the Buddha is saying here. So then the next stanza, the Buddha says, Nahi so upakamo atti yena jata namiyare jarampi patva maranang evang dhamma hi paanino. So translated here as, there is no way that those born will not die. On reaching old age, death follows. Such is the nature of living creatures. That's quite accurate. So it's nahi so upakamo atti means like there's no force or effort that you can do that will prevent death from coming after birth. So basically there's nothing we can do to prevent death from happening. And then he says, Palanamiva pakkanang pato patanato bayang evang jatana machanang nityang maranato bayang. He says, as ripe fruit is always in danger of falling, so mortals, once born, are always in danger of death. Which is also a vivid imagery. So if you think of overripe fruit from a tree, when it falls and hits the ground, it can explode and burst. So there's also that imagery of that we're constantly walking around in these bodies which at any time might fall over and burst. They might fall over and break at any time. And the next line he says, Yatapi kumbhakarasa kata mattikabhajana sabe bedana prayanta evang majjana jivitang. As clay pots made by a potter all end up being broken, so is the life of mortals. This also is reminiscent of a line from the Dhammapada where the Buddha says one should see this body as like a fragile clay pot. So, because again, this is the nature of our bodies, is that the bodies are fragile and eventually they break. And the next line he says, Dahra cha mahanta cha ye bala ye cha pandita sabbe machu vasangyanti sabbe machu parayana. He says, the young and the old, the foolish and the wise, all go under the sway of death. All are destined to die. Te sang machu paretanang gattatang paralokato napita tayate puttang nyati va pananyatike. He says, when those overcome by death leave this world for the next, a father cannot protect their child, nor relatives their kin. Again, this is a really important statement. It's recognizing that when we die, we leave everyone behind. And we cannot rely upon our relatives or anybody else to protect us or watch over us. We're on our own, and ultimately we are driven on by our karma, the results of our choices and decisions. Then the next line, Pekatang yevanyatinang pasa la lapitang putu ekame kova machanang govajovya nihati. He says, see how while relatives look on, wailing profusely, mortals are led away one by one, like a cow to the slaughter. And he says, Evang abbahato loko machunacha jarayacha tasma dira naso chanti viditva loka parayayam. He says, and so the world is stricken by old age and death. That is why the wise do not grieve, for they understand the way of the world. So this is a really interesting statement here. So far the Buddha's been laying out this very kind of grim reminder of mortality, this grim reminder that death is inevitable and unpredictable. It comes to all of us. When it happens, people are constantly crying and wailing and lamenting and grieving as they lose their loved ones. And then he says, but this is why the wise ones don't grieve. They understand the way of the world. So the Buddha is also pointing out something important here, which is that if with wisdom and comprehension we fully accept the reality of death, then we're not bothered by it anymore. So all of this wailing and lamenting that ordinary people are doing is actually completely unnecessary. It's just arising from a place of foolishness. It's arising from a lack of wisdom. It's arising from a unwillingness to accept the reality of things, an unwillingness to accept that the nature of life is that it always ends in death. And that once we come to full acceptance of that, then we're no longer stricken by grief. Then the next line he says, Yasamagang najanasi agatasya gatasava ubo ante asampassang nirattang paridevasi. So he says, for one whose path you do not know, not whence they came nor where they went, you lament in vain, seeing neither end. So this also is an interesting statement. So the Buddha is pointing out that the people that we know in this life, we haven't always known them. They came into our life at some point, but we don't know where they came from. Even if it was your own child and you were there when they were born, you still don't know where they came from before this life. And then when people die and pass on, we don't know where they're going. We don't know what kind of life they're going to end up in next. We don't know when we might see them again, if ever. So we actually just have this one brief window where for one brief period of time, we watch somebody pass through our life. But we don't know where they came from, we don't know where they're going. And the Buddha is saying, like, lamenting is senseless because we don't see either their source or their destination. We're just seeing one glimpse in the middle of their journey. So we're wailing and lamenting when they die, but that's just because we don't understand. We don't understand where they came from or where they went. We don't understand that that moment of death is just a brief step in part of a larger path. So we're making a big deal out of something which ultimately is insignificant. And the Buddha then says, Parideva yamano che kinchidattang udabbahe samulho hing samattanang kayara chenang vichakano. He says, if a bewildered person lamenting and self-harming could get any good from that, then those who see clearly would do the same. So in other words, he's saying, if there actually was any value in grieving and lamenting, then wise people would do so as well. But since he's already said once again that the wise do not grieve at death, again, this is pointing to the fact that this experience of grief and sorrow and depression when a sentient being dies is only the product of delusion. It's only the product of not seeing reality clearly. Then next he says, Nahi runnena sokena santing pappoti chetaso piyasupajjate dukkang sarirang chupahanyati. He says, not by weeping and wailing will you find peace of heart. It just gives rise to more suffering and distresses your body. And kiso vivanno bhavati hingsamattana mattana natena peta palanti niratta paridevana. He says, growing thin and pale, you harm yourself, and it does nothing to help the dead. Your lamentation is in vain. So here the Buddha is emphasizing that so when somebody dies, all that time that we spend lamenting and grieving and sorrowing and wallowing around in depression and anguish and so on, that doesn't help the person who died. All it does is make us suffer more. It's just self-injury. It's just self-harm. It doesn't bring us any benefit, and it also doesn't bring our deceased loved one any benefit. So this whole act of wallowing around in grief and misery, it doesn't do anybody any good. All it does is cause more harm. Then next the Buddha says, Sokang apajjahang jantu biyo dukkang nigacchati anuttunanto kalankatang sokasa vasang anvagu. He says, unless a person gives up grief, they fall into suffering all the more. Bewailing those whose time has come, you fall under the sway of grief. So this also is interesting. So note also the expression, one whose time has come. It's recognizing that this is a natural and inevitable thing. It's like when midday comes, we know that's just the time that's come. So then when somebody's death comes, we know, well, it's just the time for that to happen. So just recognizing this as a natural process, and that there's not actually anything fundamentally wrong here. And then he says, Anye pipasa gamine yata kamupage nare machino vasang agamma pandante vidapanino. He says, see too other people departing, passing on according to their karma. Fallen under the sway of death, beings flounder while still here. So again, emphasizing that people die and are reborn according to their own karma, according to the actions and choices that they make. And he says, Yena yena hi manyanti tatotang hoti anyata etadiso vinabhavo pasalokasa pariyayam. He says, for whatever you imagine it turns out to be something else. Such is separation, such is the way of the world. And so this first part of this stanza, Yena yena hi manyanti tatotang hoti anyata, this appears elsewhere in the suttas as well, in other contexts. And in and of itself, it's actually a very important statement. So even setting aside the context of where the Buddha is talking about death, this line, Yena yena hi manyanti tatotang hoti anyata, this means whatever one imagines it to be, whatever one thinks something is, the reality is other than that. So this is a really important statement the Buddha is making. He's, again, it's much deeper than just talking about a misunderstanding of death. He's saying, whatever we think reality is, whatever we conceptualize reality to be, that's always wrong. Our concepts and ideas about reality are always wrong. Whatever we think or conceive or imagine reality to be, reality is always different from that. So here the Buddha is pointing to the inherent fallibility of conceptualization, the inherent falseness of mental concepts and ideas. Mental concepts and ideas are never the reality of things. Reality is always different from what we think it is. So underlying that is one of the really central concepts in Buddhist practice, which is that we cannot rely on our concepts and ideas about reality. We must always be striving to come to a direct experience of things as they actually are. Setting aside what we think things are, hope things are, or imagine things are, and really trying to clearly, directly see the way things actually are, beyond our concepts, beyond our ideas, beyond our expectations and hopes and wishes. We want to see things as they actually are. So in the context of death, again, people are constantly wishing, oh, may my loved ones live forever, may I never be separated from my loved ones, may I always be with the people I like and not with the people I dislike, may aging, decay, sickness, and death never happen to me or to my loved ones. And of course, that's all utter foolishness. So this is the reality of things, is that beings are born, they decay, and they die. This is completely normal. And so we set aside our concepts and ideas and beliefs and wishes about it, and we just come to a full acceptance of the reality of the situation. Then the Buddha says, Api vasa satang jive biyo va panamanavo nyati sangha vinahoti jahati irajivitang. He says, even if a person lives 100 years or more, they are still parted from their family and leave this life behind. Again, no matter how long you live, you still have to die sooner or later. And then he says, Tasma arahato sutva vinaya paridevitang petang kalankatang desva neso labba maya iti. He says, therefore, having learned from the awakened one, dispel lamentation. Seeing the dead and departed, think, I cannot escape this. So this actually is part of the contemplation of death, which we find mentioned in many places in the suttas. The Buddha says that one of our cornerstones of our practice is to constantly remember that death will come, is to remind ourselves that death is inevitable. So always reminding ourselves that death is, one, it's natural, it's inevitable, it's unpredictable. And then recognizing the preciousness of the moments that we have for practicing Dhamma, but also recognizing the naturalness of death. So when we do experience the death of a loved one, we recognize, oh, there's not actually anything fundamentally wrong here. It's completely natural and normal. And we too will someday die, as we have died innumerable times before. So then he says, Yatha saranang aditang varina parinibbaye evampi diro sapanyo pandito kusalo naro kepang uppatitang sokang vato tu langyava dangsaye. He says, as one would extinguish a blazing refuge using water, so too an attentive one, a wise, astute, and wholesome person, would swiftly blow away grief when it arises, like the wind, a tuft of cotton. So here again, he's saying, just as if your house was on fire, you would swiftly try to put out the fire. In the same way, the moment we see grief, sorrow, lamentation arising in the mind, we should immediately try to dispel it. Just like if your own house caught fire. Then he says, Paridevang pajapancha domana sancha attano sukame sano abbahe salang attano. He says, one who seeks their own happiness would pull out the arrow from themselves, the wailing and moaning and the sadness inside. So again, just as if you were shot with an arrow, you would pull out the arrow. Recognizing that it's not doing you any good, it's just causing harm. So it's in the same way when you see that sadness and depression and grief within yourself, you recognize, oh, this is completely unnecessary self-harm, and it's time to pull that out and get rid of it. Then he says, Abbul hasallo asito santing papuya chetaso sabaso kang atikanto asoko hoti nibbutoti. He says, with arrow pulled out, unattached, having found peace of mind, overcoming all sorrow, one is free of sorrow and enlightened. So this final statement here then is talking about a fully enlightened being. So the description of a fully enlightened being as the one whose arrow is pulled out. This is found elsewhere in the suttas. It's, again, the arrow here is symbolizing self-inflicted dukkha. So once we recognize that all suffering is self-inflicted, then we can start pulling it out, getting rid of it, discarding it. And here again he's pointing to the fact that a fully enlightened being is beyond all sorrow. Nothing can make them sad or depressed. So they recognize that everything which happens in the world is completely natural, and there's no reason to be bothered by any of it. So that's the end of this discourse. We can respect the sutta with 3 sadhus, and then I'll see if there's any questions. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And hello to the people checking in online. Hello to Mano, Gregory, Maria, Jayanta, Miguel, Ana Maria, and Madeline. And I see a question here from Ana Maria. She says, what if someone gets killed? The right view was also it was their natural time to go? Actually, yes. We might have an easier time accepting this when it's a death of so-called natural causes. Like if somebody's 80 or 90 or 100 years old and they have a heart attack and die, you're just kind of like, well, it's kind of predictable. Old person has some like so-called natural cause of death. It's much easier to see, okay, fair enough. But when somebody is killed, that's a bit more challenging to see. But elsewhere in the suttas, the Buddha makes it quite clear that that also is the result of past karma. So if one's own life is cut short, well, one possible cause for that is that in previous lives, we killed other sentient beings. In previous lives, we did something to cut short the lives and opportunities of others. Therefore, in this life, we are the ones who are experiencing our life being cut short. So what makes it a bit harder to understand, and this is why the Buddha says that the full workings of karma is something which only a fully enlightened Buddha can understand, is that the killer is also creating karma. They are making a choice to kill. So they're not forced to kill. They're still making a decision, and that decision creates further karma. But the person who is being killed is experiencing the results of their own past karma. They're experiencing the consequences and results of their own past karma. But it is, again, ultimately it is in fact the truth of things. So killing is also a fact of samsara. So it's part of our practice as Buddhists to refrain from killing. It's part of our practice to not harm or injure or kill any sentient being. But we also have to accept that killing is something that happens in samsara. It happens all the time. And we can't actually stop it from happening. So we need to accept that that also is a natural phenomenon. And Madeline says, we hear this teaching so often, but it never fails to amaze me when those who profess to follow the teachings of the Buddha become distraught when their dog dies. Well, because most Buddhists are not fully enlightened. So don't expect them to act like they are. So if you're not very far along on the Buddhist path, then of course you're going to still experience sadness and depression and grief when your loved ones die. So that's not surprising at all. So again, it's a very rare and special thing to meet an enlightened person. They're not common. They're very uncommon. So don't be surprised when you see Buddhists experiencing grief and depression at the loss of loved ones. That's actually quite normal. And Palita says, is it because of our attachment to the person that makes it difficult to accept death? If it is so, then we need to let go of attachment first, am I right? I mean, that is one major aspect of it. So attachment to the person, which means we don't want them to go. We don't want to lose them. So yeah, absolutely. If you let go of that attachment, if you accept that your experiences of any person is always temporary, then you'll see there's nothing wrong. There's no problem. Another thing which can be helpful, by the way, is remembering that over the course of countless lifetimes, we're constantly dying and being reborn. And we're also constantly re-encountering the same people in different bodies, in different lives, in different forms. But actually, the Buddha is quite clear. He says that everyone we meet at some point has been mother or father, or daughter or son or sister or brother. Literally everyone we meet has at some point been a loved one in the past. And that also means that as long as we continue to cycle through the round of samsara, we'll keep running into people again. So actually, if a loved one dies, you can also think, well, I might run into them again in a future life. In one form or another. We might not recognize them when it happens, but we will run into them again eventually anyway. And again, also recognizing that we place so much importance on the people that we're currently attached to. But actually, everyone we meet used to be a loved one. So you hear like, oh, Bob, who lives in the next town, died, and you're kind of like, well, whatever, I don't know Bob. Well, maybe not this time around you don't, but maybe in your previous life, Bob was your best friend, or Bob was your dear brother or dear sister. And then you would have been really upset. But this time we're not upset at all because it's just some random stranger in the next town over. But that's actually the same with our current loved ones. The people that we currently think of as our loved ones, well, actually in the previous lifetime we didn't care at all. And in our next life we probably won't care at all. So it's also recognizing how incredibly ephemeral and temporary these attachments are. And Manal says, can all grief related to the death of a loved one be avoidable? If you're fully enlightened, then yes. If you're fully enlightened, then you will not experience any grief at all. If you're anything less than fully enlightened, then you're probably going to experience some degree of grief when you lose loved ones. Because, again, that's the function of attachment. Attachment produces grief. And that's the last question, so we'll go ahead and conclude at this time with 3 more sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you all next time.